watching around the world our top global stories. As the midnight bells chimed, the world and especially Ukrainians woke up to an anniversary like no other. It has been a year since Russia invaded Ukraine, striking residential buildings, targeting critical infrastructure and weaponizing the freezing cold. Mercifully, air raid alarms did not sound overnight in Ukraine's capital Kiev, and the early morning started quietly. Ukraine's President Zelensky marked the first anniversary of the invasion at Kiev's iconic Sofia Square. As the dawn broke, Zelensky tweeted saying that we know that 2023 will be the year of Ukraine's victory. Meanwhile, in capital Kiev, St. Michael's Church chimed its bells at midnight while damaged Russian military equipment was on show outside. Residents walked around the Independence Square as buildings lit up with the Ukrainian flag's colors of yellow and blue. Huge rays of light were launched into the sky in the Ukrainian city of Lviv. This was done in tribute to the fallen Ukrainian soldiers. The event was held at Lviv's Lychakiv cemetery, where mourners gathered, sang hymns, and held candles to pay their respects. And it wasn't Ukraine alone, as the world, in solemn solidarity with the Ukrainians, marked the one-year war anniversary. In Brussels, the European Parliament and the European Commission buildings were lit with the Ukrainian flag colors. Ukrainian flags were also raised ahead of this lighting. The same colors were seen on the Justus Lipsius and Europa buildings in Brussels as well. Portugal's parliament was lit up with the yellow and blue Ukrainian flag colors. The light display is set to remain on throughout the evening in Portugal. The Eiffel Tower in France was illuminated in the blue and yellow of the Ukrainian flag to show solidarity on the eve of the war anniversary. In the United Kingdom, public department crew was seen cleaning the street in front of the Russian embassy. Protesters had painted a giant Ukrainian flag on the road outside the Russian embassy in London. Activists poured 160 liters of paint on the road, and the moving vehicles did the rest, spreading the paint in both directions to create the Ukrainian flag. Hundreds of people from the Ukrainian community and their supporters marched through downtown Sydney in Australia to mark the year's anniversary. Protesters carried Australian and Ukrainian flags, shouted slogans as they marched, and held a vigil outside Sydney City's St. Mary's Cathedral. And before we move on to all the diplomatic developments around the war anniversary, let's also take a look at what Ukraine's President Zelensky had to say on the occasion.
A year ago, on this day, from this very place, at about 7 in the morning, I addressed you with a short statement. It lasted only 67 seconds. It contained the two most important things, then and now. That Russia started a full-scale war against us, and that we are strong. 3 days. 3 days is all that we were predicted to last. They threatened that in 72 hours we would not exist, but we survived the 4th day and then the 5th. And today we have been standing for exactly 1 year, and we still know every tomorrow is worth fighting for. The verdict is obvious. 9 years ago, the neighbor became an aggressor. A year ago, the aggressor became an executioner, looter, and terrorist. We have no doubt that they will be held accountable. We have no doubt that we will win.
Sending a strong message on the war anniversary, the United Nations General Assembly approved a non-binding resolution. It calls for Russia to end hostilities in Ukraine and withdraw its forces immediately. This even as the US is now moving to slam Russia with more sanctions. As diplomats reacted after the resolution was passed. The larger message from the United Nations body was clear. Moscow's aggression must stop. The resolution drafted by Ukraine in consultation with its allies was passed with a majority of 141 to 7. There were 32 abstentions as well, including Asian heavyweights, India and China. The 7 countries voting against the resolution were Belarus, Nicaragua, Russia, Syria, North Korea, Eritrea and Mali, all having close military ties with Russia. And even though the United Nations General Assembly resolutions are not legally binding, unlike the United Nations Security Council resolutions, they end up serving as a barometer of world opinion. The body has become the most important UN organ dealing with Ukraine because the UN Security Council is paralyzed by Russia's veto power. Meanwhile, the US State Department is voicing support for the United Nations General Assembly. US President Joe Biden will be virtually meeting with G7 leaders, and Ukraine's President Zelensky is set to announce new sanctions against those aiding Russia's war efforts. The same group came together last year, hours after Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine. The sanctions will include Russian banks, technology and defense sectors, and will impact both people and companies involved in the conflict. The US will also announce a fresh Ukrainian aid package that will include economic, security and energy support. This even as von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, said that the group aims to train 30,000 Ukrainian soldiers. China's foreign ministry reiterated that Beijing had released a 12-point plan regarding the political resolution on the Ukrainian crisis, which includes a ceasefire and peace talks option. China says it's willing to work with the international community so that it can contribute to a resolution between Russia and Ukraine. Meanwhile, Ukraine is bracing for possible fresh Russian attacks on key cities. In an address to mark the Defender of the Fatherland holiday in Russia, President Putin said he will deploy new Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missiles, nicknamed Satan II, as well as hypersonic missiles and new nuclear submarines. On the other hand, Ukrainian soldiers of the 3rd Tank Iron Brigade participated in training drills from positions close to the front line in northeast Ukraine. This even as Russian soldiers are concentrating units further south along the Kreminna-Lyman line in a bid to secure the borders of Luhansk and Donetsk provinces in eastern Ukraine. Now, on the war anniversary, let's also take a stock of it in all ways possible. So what's the cost of the war so far? We begin with the humanitarian cost. More than 8,000 innocent civilians have been killed in the war so far, according to estimates by the United Nations Human Rights Council. However, the Ukrainian government claims that over 16,000 civilians have died in the war so far. And according to Norway's estimates, there have been 30,000 civilian deaths due to the year-long war. The United Nations Human Rights Council estimates also say that 60% of the casualties were men, while 40% were women. 87 children are said to have been killed, while nearly 1,000 of them have been injured. The estimates vary even more when it comes to the numbers of soldiers killed or wounded. Norway estimates that 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed or wounded in the war, while that number for Russian soldiers stands at 180,000. Another estimate by the United Kingdom's Defense Ministry says that 60,000 Russian soldiers have been killed already, while 110 to 140,000 of them have been wounded. Ukraine's armed forces also claim that more than 140,000 Russian soldiers have been killed in the war so far. Bear in mind, Ukraine does not reveal the figures of its dead and wounded, nor does Russia, but Ukraine's armed forces had stated that 9,000 soldiers were dead back in the month of August last year itself. Nearly 22 million Ukrainians are in need of humanitarian assistance immediately, and it will take over $5.5 billion to help them. Let's now focus on the cost of war to Ukraine's economy. Ukraine's GDP for the year 2022 is down by 30%. Inflation is soaring at nearly 14%. According to the Kiev School of Economics, nearly $140 billion worth of infrastructure has been destroyed in the war, while the World Bank has put the cost of reconstruction in Ukraine at nearly $350 billion. A year to the Ukraine war, let's now go back to where it all began. When the war began, the West started slamming sanctions on Russian exports. And angered by that, Russia decided to block all exports by Ukraine, including wheat, food grains, and even oil. Ukrainian Agriculture Ministry data says that the country's wheat shipments have dropped by around 40% over the last year to just about 11 million metric tons. To understand how important Ukraine's wheat exports are to the world, we need to delve deep into it. Ukraine, also known as one of the bread baskets of the world along with Russia, was ranked 4th among the largest exporters of wheat worldwide before the war began, with the total exports volume reaching over 24 million metric tons. Since the beginning of the Russian invasion, wheat exports from both Russia and Ukraine have reduced drastically. Russia and Ukraine are very important countries in terms of not just wheat, but all kinds of food grains exports. They together export nearly a third of the world's wheat and barley, more than 70% of sunflower oil, and are big suppliers of corn as well. Months into the war, food shortages started hitting developing and underdeveloped countries. By the mid of the year 2022, 20 million tons of Ukrainian grain was prevented from getting to the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Asia. 90% of wheat and other grain from Ukraine are shipped to the world markets by sea, and Russian ships and sea mines block Ukrainian Black Sea ports. Prior to the Russian invasion, Ukraine exported on an average about 6 million tons of agrarian commodities every month. Last year, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization projected that over 180 million people in more than 40 countries could face a food crisis, or worse, hunger. And that's because Ukraine alone contributes more than 11% of the world's cereal grains exports, while Russia contributes nearly 8%. That put together is nearly 20%. Looking at the gravity of the situation, the Black Sea Grain Initiative was brokered by the United Nations and Turkey last July, allowing grains to be exported from 3 Ukrainian ports. The agreement was extended by a further 120 days in November 2022 and is up for renewal again in the month of March this year. But Russia has shown its unhappiness with some aspects of the deal and has asked for the lifting of sanctions affecting its own agricultural exports first. And that's all we have time for in this edition of Around the World. Thank you so much for watching. Keep it with News 9 Plus.